Does it strike you like it strikes us that Jane in the Tarzan books and in the TV series, it's me Tarzan, you Jane?
Yeah, well, come on. I mean, you know, I fell passionately in love with Tarzan, this glorious Lord of the Jungle, and he went and chose the wrong Jane. I was really jealous.
Did you relate more to the Jane character or more to Tarzan?
Oh, and I thought she was awful.
You wanted to be Tarzan?
Yes.
Jane Goodall, what's your drink?
It's Scotch whiskey.
You were telling me that you keep a little Scotch whiskey around sometimes.
For my throat.
For your throat, because you speak a lot.
Over, cheers.
Cheers. Thank you for being here.
I speak and speak and speak, and sometimes, you know, when you get older especially, I don't know if your vocal cord stretches or shrinks, whatever it does, this
is the trick.
This is the trick.
I'll have a sip too. Thank you. Thank you for being here. The question that I always ask first, it's a big one. How did you get here? How did you become Jane Goodall?
Well, it started really when I was a tiny little girl. It really did. I was born loving animals. I had a mother who supported that love.
Yeah.
She didn't get mad when I was 1.5, and apparently she found my bed full of earth and earthworms because I wondered how they could walk without legs. That's what she thought. She didn't get mad when I disappeared, when she took me to stay on a farm and was gone for 4 hours.
Just
They
exploring.
called the police. No, I was in a hen house waiting to see how a hen laid an egg because
Really?
I couldn't see a hole big enough. I was apparently asking everybody, and I'd been given the job of collecting the eggs.
And how old were you?
4.5.
So it wasn't always chimpanzees then?
No,
or primates?
No, and Mum found books for me about animals, thinking I'd learn to read more quickly. So I was 8 when I was reading Dr. Dolittle, and then 10 when I discovered this little second-hand books. We didn't have much money, which I could just afford from saving up my few pennies of pocket money. And I took it home and I read it from cover to cover, and that was called Tarzan of the Apes.
Does it strike you like it strikes us that Jane in the Tarzan books and in the TV series, it's me Tarzan, you Jane?
Yeah, well, come on. I mean, you know, I fell passionately in love with Tarzan, this glorious Lord of the Jungle, and he went and chose the wrong Jane. I was really jealous.
Did you relate more to the Jane character or more to Tarzan?
Oh, and I thought she was awful.
You wanted to be Tarzan?
Yes.
Yeah. And you carried that, from what I understand, all the way until you started waitressing as a young woman. Is that right?
I did super well at school, but we couldn't afford university. So that's when I did a secretarial course. And it was while I was working with a job in London with actually documentary films that I got a letter from a school friend inviting me to Kenya for a holiday because her parents had bought a farm.
Oh.
So there was the opportunity. The waitressing was in order to raise the money because you couldn't save up in London.
To go to Kenya.
To go to Kenya. And by boat in those days. There's no planes going back and forth.
Sure. What year was that? Do you remember?
That was 1957.
So your very first trip to Kenya is 1957.
Yes.
And that's before Louis Leakey, right?
That's when I met him. I heard about him. Somebody said, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis. So I rang up. I was actually scared of ringing up, but I was so passionate about animals. And he agreed to see me, and he took me around. He asked me hundreds of questions because I'd gone on reading every book about African animals I could find and spent hours in the Natural History Museum in London. And because of that, I could answer many of his questions. Yeah. So he then took me to one of his early digs in Olduvai Gorge, which is the middle of the Serengeti. Just him, his wife, one other young girl, and a few Kenyans.
Wow.
And all the animals were there. And I think in the 3 months we were there, we only saw 4 Maasai warriors. That was it.
Do you remember how you felt?
I was in my dream. Excited. It was just almost too good to be true.
You didn't grow up dreaming of white picket fence and marriage and children and all that?
No, not at all.
What was the dream?
I'm going to grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals and write books about them. It wasn't any particular animal, it was just Africa and animals.
You know, you don't meet a whole lot of people who have lived their dream, who
No,
had
I
that
guess
dream as
so.
a child and lived it out.
Never changed.
Yeah. So you meet Professor Leakey, and is it true that Dr. Leakey applies for a grant to send someone to watch chimpanzees for 6 months, right?
Yeah. He wanted, well, 6 months was all he could get. And it was an American businessman. And he said, all right, Lewis, well, here's money for 6 months. We'll see how she does. Because who was going to give money to a young, untrained girl, never been to college?
I was going to say, why did he pick you?
Because I think it was really when we were on the Serengeti. And he saw how I behaved when, you know, like one evening, Julie and I were out there and there was this young male lion. And he was really close and fascinated. He was curious. And Julian wanted to go down into the gorge where it's thick vegetation to hide. And I said, the lion will know where we are, but we won't know where he is. We have to climb up out of the gorge onto the plains, which is what we did. Leakey thought I did just exactly right.
He saw your instincts.
And so he thought I would be the person he'd been looking for. He says for years. He wanted somebody to study chimps because he was digging up the fossils of our Stone Age ancestors. He believed, as people do now, that about 6 million years ago there was a ape-like, human-like creature, a common ancestor from which chimpanzees have evolved and we have evolved. And you know, when you have a fossil in your hand, you can tell an awful lot about what the creature looked like. Not its color, but from the shape of the bone, you can see if it stood upright, the muscle attachments, the wear on the teeth, what did it eat, the living floors, you could see the kind of tools, but behavior doesn't fossilize.
1957, you go on this first trip.
Yeah.
Was anyone doing this kind of thing?
No. I mean, George Schaller had spent some time with gorillas, that was it.
Weren't you scared?
No. So it took a year for him to get the money. And then the British authorities in what was then Tanganyika, sort of crumbling British Empire, they wouldn't take responsibility for a young girl alone. That's why my mother came. She volunteered.
Yeah, you brought your mom.
Yeah.
How did that conversation go? Hey, Mom, I have an idea.
It was Leakey who persuaded her to come. Because he wanted somebody, you know, okay, they said finally, okay, we'll have her if she has a companion. He wanted to be sure that whoever came with me would be supportive, wouldn't try and take the limelight, wouldn't try and persuade me to do something in a different way. And he knew my mother was supportive and would be the ideal person. She was.
You go off to Africa. The documentary has found this footage.
I get to Gombe with Mum. The chimps have never seen anything like this. They run away and run away and run away, and I'm getting terrified that the money will run out before I've seen anything exciting. I mean,
So you can't get close.
Yes, I knew if I had time I could do it. But 6 months isn't very long, actually. So Mum was boosting my morale. You're learning more than you think. You found a peak, you've got your binoculars, you're learning about their foods, their calls, they make nests at night. And so she was an amazing morale booster. And she had to leave after 4 months. And that just after that was when this chimpanzee, David Greybeard, was using and making tools to fish for termites.
Which was a huge revelation.
Which was huge, because at that time it was thought humans and only humans use and make tools. And we were described as man, the tool maker. So that when I sent a telegram to Louis Leakey, because, you know, there was no computers, laptops, nothing like that, he sent a telegram back saying, now we shall have to redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimps as humans. And that enabled him to go to National Geographic. And they agreed not only to continue to fund the research when that 6 months money ran out, but they sent a photographer and filmer, Hugo van Lauwijk. And so it was his pictures and film that took the story of Jane and the chimps to homes across America and then around the world.
You talked about getting close to the chimps. You really got close. I mean, you were able eventually to get them to come right up to you.
Yes. Well,
how did you do that?
Well, David Greybeard was the termite fishing chimp, and he lost his fear before the others. They're all different, they all have their personalities. And one day he came to my camp. I wasn't there because every morning I was up in the hills before light. And my cook told me that a chimp had been, and I was very excited. But
To your camp?
Yeah, because there was an oil palm in it fruiting. And so he came every day for a few days, and then he found some bananas and took them. So I said, well, Dominic, leave the bananas out. Maybe he'll come back when the tree stops fruiting. And he did, and other chimps followed him. And that led to the banana feeding, which was really built up when Hugo arrived.
Yeah.
Because he wouldn't have got his footage in those days otherwise, because out in the forest, you know, it's dark and chimps are black. The geographic wouldn't have been satisfied. But because the chimps came to the camp, he could get this amazing footage. Yeah. And so they carried on funding the study, which was amazing.
You say in the documentary, I just want to throw one quote at you. You say in the documentary, all the time I was getting closer to animals and nature, and as a result, closer to myself, more in tune with the spiritual power that I felt all around. Talk about that. What do you mean more in tune with yourself?
When I was first at Gombe, I was so passionate about succeeding to get close to the chimps that I didn't really, I mean, I was just doing that, focused totally on that. But once I began to relax, because I, you know, got funding now, I spend hours alone out in the forest, and there's this feeling of interconnectedness of all life forms, where every little species plays its part. And there were the birds and the insects and all the life in the forest. And I've always felt very close to a great spiritual power when I'm out in the forest. And so when you're there, first of all, there's a strange double thing here, because first of all, you forget that you exist, but you're part of this forest world. And so when you start reflecting about that, you learn more about who you are as well.
You meet Hugo, he comes in to photograph. And you
I'm
said
very
it before.
resistant. I didn't want him to come because I resented somebody coming into my world with the chimps. But okay, this is the condition of getting the money, so what will be will be. And okay, I must make the best of it. And so Hugo comes, and luckily he's not a great big looming presence. He was quiet, his voice was quiet, and he began to fit really well into...
He had the same dream you had.
Yes, he wanted to photograph them, and I wanted to watch them and write books.
You end up falling in love.
We end up falling in love, and we produce a baby. Actually, when I watched that movie, what a beautiful child he was, wasn't he?
Yes.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that, because I think for a lot of women who may watch, they'll want to know how that changed things for you, motherhood, and having a child, and now you can't as easily run off to Africa.
Well, I was in Africa.
Right.
I was able to keep him with me. And from the chimps, I learned the importance of those first years, that it's really important for an infant to have 2 or 3 adults with whom, or upon whom, the child can absolutely trust. And it doesn't have to be the biological mother, but at least some adults there who provide, you know.
Right.
And so for the first 3 years of his life, I didn't leave him for one night. When he was at Gombe, we had to be very careful, because chimps have been known to eat human infants. You know, they eat other primates.
Sure.
People eat chimps.
That would have scared a lot of people off,
Well,
by the way.
I had him in a cage before he could crawl, and it was painted blue, and it had mobiles. There was always somebody there. He was never alone.
You had become, it seems like you'd become really interested in Flo, one of the mothers in the chimpanzee group. Tell me how she influenced you.
Well, Flo actually showed the same characteristics as my own mother. Basically, supportive, supportive, supportive. And we now know, looking back, that the good mothers, there's good and bad, the supportive mothers, their offspring do better. the females are better mothers. The males tend to reach a higher position in the hierarchy and therefore probably sire more offspring. And I don't know, I mean, Grub was raised on a mixture of...
Grub is your son.
Grub is my son. No, it was a chimp called Goblin. And he was a mucky eater, so he was known as Goblin Grub. Grub was a mucky eater, so he was known as Grublin Gob. And then
okay. So the nickname Grub.
Grub, yeah. So there was a maternal instinct, which I don't know, might have been sufficient, I don't know. But I had the example of my own mother. I'd watch Flo, and then at that time Dr. Spock was in vogue, and I'd read his books, which actually have a lot of really good common sense in them. So I was raised with a mixture of all those things, but the main thing is support, support, support.
Over the years, your husband and you spend time apart.
Yeah.
And eventually it sounds like the marriage just
Well,
sort
it
of,
couldn't
you
work.
grew
You know,
apart.
he had to be doing his filming. The Geographic wouldn't or couldn't support him staying at Gombe. They thought they had enough, which is, we're actually still collecting brand new behaviour, even now, all these years later. And so he was on the Serengeti, that was his life. I was Gombe, that was mine. And we stayed friends.
As you look back on it now, you're, do you mind me saying, you're 83?
3.
You tried to age yourself to 84, but you're not yet
Well,
84.
not quite. I'm 83 and a half.
83 and a half. What was the biggest barrier to getting where you are today?
Probably the lack of funds, because you have to fight for money to keep, you know, we've got Gombe, we're in 7 African countries, we're working to alleviate poverty in the surrounding communities because we need them as partners. We're trying to do something about the rapidly disappearing chimps and forests.
And you're still doing all this work as we speak.
Still doing all this work, yeah.
And not anything to do with being a woman, because I think people might wonder, you know, if it was harder for you because...
No, I think it was probably easier in many different ways. Louis Leakey thought women made better observers. He felt that we'd be more patient. And actually in those days, you know, when you were growing up back then, as I was, the thing for a woman, you could get a job as a secretary or a nurse or a missionary's wife or a teacher. You could go out in the field, and you sort of expected at some point a white knight would come along and gather you up and look after you for the rest of your life. That was the kind of...
That was the traditional...
yes.
Yeah,
so I didn't think about it. I just was doing what I wanted to do, and I didn't think about marriage and children and things. But that just happened, and everything in my life has seemed to, you know, if I look back on it, I had to make a decision here and there, but it was all laid out for me. I just had to make the right choice. It's been very strange.
What's the lesson for people who are still young and trying to be where you are? What's the lesson?
I think that what my mother said, you know, if you really want something, you have to work really hard. You have to take advantage of opportunity and don't give up. And I think the danger is that young people want to say they want to do out in the field. It's competitive, there's shrinking funds. You've got to really want to do it. But if you can't get there now, do something else. Raise some money, but don't give up the dream, and then you can go back to it later.
83 years in, it's been a pretty good life.
Yeah.
Jane, thank you so much, Dr.
Cheers.
Goodall.
Thank you.
Thank you.